So today I wanted to talk about the role of grammar for language learning and specifically for independent learners. I noticed that a lot of people, when they start learning a foreign language, often worry about how much time they should dedicate to grammar and how exactly they should study it. So I just wanted to share my views on it. Traditionally, grammar has always played a heavy role in language learning. Both in schools and textbooks, content is pretty much grammar-centric. What happens is that students learn vocabulary and grammar first, and only after they get exposure to language. And this method is also called as the skill building method. Now, what I think we should do is exactly the opposite. We should get enough exposure to the language first, and then consult grammar sparingly. So the important thing here is the order in which we do things. Now, learning grammar first is, in my opinion, a waste of time because your brain lacks enough language reference for you to fully understand a grammar point and internalize it. Since the role of grammar is to give you a theoretical understanding of how a language works, you first need to get a good amount of input that will provide you with enough context so that you can get full advantage of the grammar explanation that you're going to read. So now that it's clear at what point of the learning process you need to look up grammar, now let's investigate how much grammar you usually need to learn actively and how much time you should put into it. Now, how much grammar do you need to study actively? The answer, in my opinion, is not much. The idea here is that our brains can recognize patterns almost subconsciously with enough exposure to them. So the more you bombard your brain with input, the more it'll start slowly picking up patterns in the language. And in my experience, I can tell you that this is true, regardless of the language I've studied. I've started using input-based studying both with Spanish and Korean, and I noticed that in both those languages, I was picking up a lot of grammar just by getting input. Now, of course, there are patterns that are going to be more obscure than others, so I suggest looking up only those you have difficulty understanding. But they're not going to be as many as the ones that you're going to passively absorb. Now let's discuss how much time you should spend looking up grammar. Now, I don't really have a specific answer to it because it really depends. Now, first of all, it depends on how much you enjoy grammar and looking up rules in general. Because if you like it, go ahead and spend how much time you want doing it. But if you don't like it, it's not compulsory. You shouldn't feel pressured to study grammar if you don't want to. So you could theoretically spend 0 minutes or all day. It's really up to you. As far as I'm concerned, you know that I'm a huge input fan, so I prioritize input over grammar. And I really have one rule when it comes to that. And that rule is I allow myself to look up a grammar structure or a pattern only when I'm curious about it. That is, only when I'm reading or listening, getting input in general. And while doing it, I get curious about a certain pattern. Only then I'll look it up. The reason is because for a grammar rule to stick, you need to be curious about it. And this is why it's super important to use content that you're interested in, because in that way, it'll be easier for you to get curious about why something is worded in a specific way. And not only it'll be easier to understand because you look up a grammar point after getting exposure, but it will also be harder to forget because that grammar point is somewhat tied to a good experience, that is you reading something that you're interested in. So that's it for this video. Feel free to ask me any questions here or directly on my Instagram, which I started using a little more regularly. And also, I'd like to know how you like to study grammar, if you like it or not, if you do it, if you don't, how you do it. I'm super curious about it. Now, next week, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite topics when it comes to language learning, and that is bottom-up learning versus top-down learning and systems thinking in language learning, which is actually closely related to this video here. So next week, I'll actually talk a little more in depth about why it's important to study grammar after getting exposure. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.